Well, the most interesting part about what we're talking about, this Holocaust scenario, I didn't really know about it growing up. It was never really mentioned in our household. He never talked about truly his experiences. It was something that, not that he was ashamed of it, it was just something that he started like a new life. You know, everything was new here. And the interesting thing about my father is he never complains, never. But he never really talked about those experiences. Neither did my grandmother talk about those experiences, but they were there. And as years go on, he was sought out by the Shoah. And really, when he did the Shoah interview, we started really asking questions. And I think that that's, together with everything else, things just come out, and he wants everybody to know about what happened. He doesn't want pity, but he wants everybody to know the truth.
My name is Ralph Franklin, but when I was born in 1928, my parents named me Rudolf Hans Freundlich, which was a normal name. Everybody was going to call me Rudy, and most people did for a good bit of my life. Anyway, I was born in a small town called Schlochau. This town was at that time in eastern Germany, very close to the Polish border, but on the German side. Now, my family had lived there for years. My grandfather was born in the same town. So I was in first grade, and it was a small school, but it was a city school. The town itself had about 6,000 people in it, so it was the only school in town. I had no problems. I did well in school, and then unfortunately, after I graduated first grade, and they did consider it like graduation, you got presents and all that. Unfortunately, my parents separated, and my mother moved with me to her parents' house, which was in another small town, quite a few miles away, but in the same general area of Germany. At this point, I was ready to start second grade, and my grandfather, her father, had a plowshare factory and a farm, about 200 or so acres. And the factory was a very unusual organization. They manufactured parts for plowshares. They used old scrap iron and melted it down and made plowshares out of it with huge hammers driven by water power. Now, at this point, everything went along well. I was toward the end of fifth grade, and unfortunately came a day, November the 10th, 1938, now known as Kristallnacht, Crystal Night. It's a day that the Gestapo, with a bunch of hoodlums, you can call them, they weren't soldiers, they were civilians, started smashing up Jewish businesses, homes, in our case, furniture. They did everything that they could to make it miserable for Jewish people, and that all Jewish men apparently were being arrested, as was my uncle and my father. They put them in a car and they started to drive off with them. My mother asked one of the Gestapo officers, what did they do? What did my husband do? What crime did he commit? The man just looked at her and said, he's a Jew. But then the Nazis passed laws, all sorts of laws. I was 10 years old, I wasn't too involved in it, but one of those laws was that Jews weren't allowed to have businesses and Jews weren't allowed to own property. So we had both, a business and a property. So a buyer was found, but the buyer made an offer which had to be accepted. We had no choice because we had to get rid of it by a certain date. Time came when it was time to make the final settlement for the business. And here we were, my grandmother, the were then the legal owner of the business. My grandmother was a good cook, she was a good housekeeper, but she knew nothing about running a business. My mother went to the Gestapo office and explained the situation, and actually she was supported by the buyer that we need, my uncle, who was at that time had been running the business, he would be the one to explain, to take care of the technical details, how the office operated, how the business operated, who the customers were, and so forth. And they could see the point, and they did let my uncle out of the concentration camp. So here it was November or December 1938, and here came my uncle home from the concentration camp. By the way, this concentration camp was the same one that my father was sent to, and they both were serving time there, not as real prisoners, not because they had caused any crimes, but because they were Jews. And what they did there was hard labor, road building, things like that. Neither of them had any experience or any knowledge of or had the right kind of muscles to do this kind of work, but they had to do it without protective clothing, without gloves. So when my uncle came home, he had all kind of frostbite. His hands were in bad condition, his feet were in bad condition, and he was all bandaged up, but he got home. At that point, my father was still in the camp. This concentration camp is not one of the well-known ones. It was not an extermination camp, it was a labor camp, and it was in the northern part of Germany. Sachsenhausen was the name. So the next law that the Germans passed was Jews had to get out of this province of Germany, and we ended up going to Berlin. Fortunately, we were able to rent a couple of rooms from another Jewish family in Berlin. My grandmother and mother and my father, even though they were separated, had applied to get out of the country, get to the United States. Why would we choose the United States? We were ready to go anywhere, but in the United States we had some relatives. 2 of those 4 uncles were still alive. They were up in years, in their 70s, but they were living, and they immediately were willing to help and issued an affidavit of support for the American immigration authorities. And they did legalize this affidavit. And now we were on the list. What kind of a list? We got a number, a quota number. And when that number would come up, then they would permit us to come into the country. But here I was now going into 7th grade, and I was 11 years old, and here I was somewhat safe. But what could I do? What can an 11-year-old kid do? Most children here go to the movies, go to the zoo, you can go to the parks, public parks and libraries. None of those things was permitted. I was a Jew. What could I do? I could ride trolley cars. That's what I did. I rode those trolley cars, I rode buses, I rode subways, got to know the city very well, passed by these beautiful, huge museums. Couldn't go in, but I could see them from the outside. In February, we got the date that we would be leaving Germany, and it was to be March 11th. Well, that was a great date. That was a great day to look forward to. And we were to pack 1 suitcase we were allowed per person. We went to the consulate where we got final instructions, where we got the final papers, and we were told that the Germans would allow us to take out exactly 10 marks per person. 10 marks was $4. The people at the consulate told us that down the street was an office called American Express Company. You got to remember, America was not at war at that time. Now, when my parents had to go to the consulate, my father was still in Sachsenhausen in the concentration camp. My mother went back to the authorities, explained the situation, that the American authorities want to interview him. And since America was a neutral country, and the Germans didn't want to insult the Americans, they left my father come out of the concentration camp. So he was back with us. We had an official who was sort of like, he was so old he must have been retired, but he was sitting there watching us pack. And he was from the Customs Bureau, I guess. And he seemed like he's ready to doze off to go to sleep anyway. But my mother got him to go to the kitchen where she gave him a shot of liquor. And while that was happening, I took 2 or 3 books that I had lying there and shoved them in under my underwear into the suitcase. So I had a couple of books to start reading when I first would get to the United States. And thus it went. So everything got done legally. We had to paint certain yellow stripes onto the suitcases. We had to put in the word Lissabon. Lissabon is the German way of saying Lisbon, Portugal. And that would be the port from which we would leave. By the way, to get to the port and to get to on the ship, how would all this be paid for? It all had to be paid for in American dollars. And my uncles paid for everything. We got back on the train and went through southern Spain. And that evening, or rather the next morning, we crossed the border from Spain into Portugal. That was March 15th, my birthday.